Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for week 2 of Camp Prosperity 2022, Permission to Engage, Equipping Ambassadors to Advocate for Change. So we'll give people maybe another 30 seconds to continue to join, and then we will start with the webinar. Thank you again for joining us. Hello and welcome again to week 2 of Camp Prosperity 2022. Just a few quick housekeeping notes to keep in mind. We will be recording this to share out and mail out to registrants, so you should get that within 1 week from this webinar. Also, you're muted to ensure sound quality, but we do want you to use the question box to ask us questions, engage with the speakers and the panelists for this webinar. And also, if you're experiencing any technical issues, our first tip is to first log off and then log back in. And if you continue to have persistent issues, please email gotomeeting@prosperitynow.org. And here are a few tips and tricks just to ensure that today's webinar is successful for you. First, we want you to get cozy, join from a quiet place, grab some coffee or a snack and settle in so that you can be completely comfortable as you're taking in all of the great content that we have for you today. Also, engage with us, speak to us using the comments or the questions box, and also talk to us on engage us on social media. So please, we will be tweeting for this webinar, so feel free to send your messages using hashtag Camp Prosperity and also tag Prosperity Now as you continue to talk to us on Twitter. And also reflect on ways to apply what you learn here today to your own work. So use this time to either confirm some fundamental beliefs or also challenge your thinking and undergo some paradigm shifts. So again, thank you for joining us. And without further ado, I will introduce Vanna Cure.
Great, thank you so much, Olivia, and welcome everyone to week 2 of Camp Prosperity. We are so excited to join you for a second week. Last week, as you all know, we kicked off the series with our first webinar, The New Change Agent, where we discussed advocacy limits for nonprofits and who and how to engage at every level of government. This week, as you'll see on the next slide, we'll focus on equipping ambassadors to advocate for change. While we know that nonprofit advocates are critical in lifting up community challenges and solutions, the voices of those most impacted must be centered and elevated. So today we'll discuss how nonprofits can work with community members and other stakeholders to collectively push for policy change at the local, state, and federal levels. And you can see there on the slide, this is the second of 3 webinars. Next week, we will finish off with a session on equity to justice. So I hope that you all will join us next Tuesday at this same time for our final webinar in the series. Moving along here, I want to share with you some ways that we would like to engage in some fun opportunities for you all to try to win prizes on Camp Prosperity this afternoon. We always try to make this series feel as interactive as possible. We know that there are limits to the amount of interaction that can be had on a virtual series, but we still like to try to have some fun and allow people opportunities to engage with us and win things. So to achieve that, we've included several ways for you to win prizes through this series. During each session, we'll award a prize to the top tweeter. So if you have Twitter, please log in, find Prosperity Now's Twitter page, either retweet us. If you hear one of our speakers saying a really nice quote that you enjoy or something that really resonates with you, tweet that out and use the hashtag Camp Prosperity or ask questions through Twitter. Use the hashtag Camp Prosperity, ask us questions, ask speakers questions. But anyway, just really engage with us on social media. We will award a small prize to the top tweeter at the end of the session today. So definitely tweet and use that hashtag. Secondly, we will also do a pop quiz like we always do at the end of this webinar. So pay attention if you hear some things that sound like they are pop quizable. I think I just made that word up. If you hear some things that sound like they are able to be pop quiz questions, jot them down. We'll have a pop quiz at the end of the session, where we'll ask a question, and the first person to type the correct answer into the questions box will win a small prize. So be on the lookout for that question. And then lastly, if you fill out our post-webinar survey, you will be entered to win a small prize from Prosperity Now. And I do want to announce that Alyssa Wrightfield, I think I am pronouncing your name correct, from Detroit, Alyssa Wrightfield, you were the winner for last week's survey. So we'll send you out a small prize from Prosperity Now. But yes, please engage with us on Twitter, through the pop quiz, and through taking our survey for an opportunity to win a prize. And so joining us today as speakers, we are really excited about today's conversation, excited to welcome these 4 speakers, these 4 panelists with us today. Treyana Holiday, who is the Media Director for King County Equity Now over in Seattle. Javier Martinez, I see we've got Nichelle up there, but it should say Javier Martinez, who is the Executive Director for Partnership for Community Action over in New Mexico. Jamie Rogers, who is the President and CEO of Urban Neighborhood Initiative in Kansas City, and Radha Giri, who's the Director of Policy and Systems Change for Saber Life over in California. We are really grateful that these 4 speakers could lend their time and expertise today, and we're excited to talk to them in just a few minutes here. As far as today's agenda, I will do a poll question in just a second, just to get a sense of who's on the webinar today. We want to hear from you and get a sense of what your roles are and what your experience level is at your respective organization. After our poll question, we'll dive right into our panel conversation today. Today's webinar will be full panel style discussion. We call it a fireside chat, where we will focus on equipping ambassadors. After that, we will do a group discussion and a Q&A, but as always, feel free to post your comments and questions in the questions box throughout today's webinar, and we'll get those answered. And then lastly, we will go over some next steps, and we'll close out today's webinar. So for our poll question today, we want to get a sense of where you are as far as advocacy. Which level of advocacy do you engage in most? So are you most engaged in federal advocacy, state advocacy, local and municipal advocacy, none of them, or all of them? So if you all will take a quick second to just fill out our poll question and give our speakers a sense of who we have on today's webinar. All right, and let's take a look at the results here. It looks like a great majority of you are either doing state or local advocacy, so I hope that that is helpful for our speakers. Another 23% of you are doing all of them, and then 15% of you are doing none of them. So that's very helpful to know. Thank you all for taking a second to fill out our poll question. So with that, let's hop right into our conversation this afternoon. Again, we are focused on permission to engage, how we equip ambassadors to advocate for change. So let's dive right into our first panel question. The first thing that we want to know from our panelists is, we know that policy issues can sometimes be complex and difficult to understand. Want to know from you all, how have you been able to take complex policy issues and message them in ways that resonate with the community? And for our panelists, before you dive in and answer this question, if you'll take a second to just introduce yourself to our audience today, and then proceed forward with the answer. So Radha, we'll start with you on this question.
Thank you, Vanna, and it's great to be with all of you today. My name is Radha Giri, and I am the Policy Director for Saber Life. We are based indeed in California. We have a nationwide reach. We have members all over the country, almost 600,000 folks who are building savings accounts, short-term and long-term, to build a better life for themselves and their families. And we took a very intentional approach with the federal child tax credit when it came out, and the first monthly payment came out last July, with an intention to engage our members nationwide to the extent possible. So our first step, the very first thing we did, was we determined their needs. We took a poll to get a sense of how many folks have heard about this program and where we needed to do our work to build awareness and build our information outreach. And we learned that right around the time the first payment came out, that there was not a lot of awareness, especially with new or first-time tax filers. So that informed our efforts going forward. For instance, only 1/3 had heard a lot about the child tax credit. About 37% had heard some, and 13% of Save Our Life members had heard nothing about the child tax credit last July. Next slide, please. So that information, getting a baseline set of information about awareness, helped determine our strategy going forward. We determined that we would build a content series to break down the complexities of a federal tax program like the child tax credit to the folks that we work with. We conducted interviews as in addition to having a survey to really get to talk to folks about their motivations, what were their challenges, what trade-offs they were experiencing as they were trying to access the child tax credit, or any information barriers in the way. So we decided that we would take to employ a few tools to build a content series. One was a series of expert articles. So they're trusted content series that our members could rely upon for the veracity of the information. We would share those expert articles on social media so that there would be a regular feed of information. We'd share this out on the periodic newsletter. And then we had an interactive quiz. And it turned out that the interactive quiz was head and shoulders the most popular piece of content that we put out. It was a very simple quiz about the child tax credit and information about it. And I think people found that really fun. And so we had more than 10,000 sessions of folks using this interactive quiz about the child tax credit, which sort of blew away our previous numbers on other types of content. Next slide, please. So looking at some of the expert articles that we put out, this was sort of the foundation of our content around the child tax credit and building out that engagement. We put out some articles and we got some numbers about how many folks read the articles and what was the engagement with the articles. And having this one-stop guide to child tax credit resources was by and large the most popular. It was one place to go to find out all the information that folks needed to obtain about the child tax credit. Ended up being a convenient and reliable source to learn more about the issue. Next slide, please. How did some of our social media perform and what were some of the winning headlines there? Well, overall, we had over 16,000 impressions on social media. There was impressions in August of last year, nearly 2/3 of all Twitter impressions were related to the child tax credit. And the best performing tweet was about myth busting, which tied into our early findings that there were some information barriers in the way about this federal program. And busting those myths made it fun and broke down that tax-related policy into something more digestible. Next slide, please. The interactive quiz here ended up being one of the most popular pieces of content that we put out, and really helped to destigmatize and break down this federal policy into digestible and easy to understand, and dare I say fun format of understanding of building engagement around this issue. We learned that 94% of Save Our Life members wanted to save some of the CTC payments, which came out of that interactive quiz, which was something they pledged to do. And previous quizzes had sort of engagement between 250 to 350. Maybe our top performing quiz was 3,500 sessions, and this particular quiz was over 10,000. It was a very popular content series, and delivered in a format that was easily digested. Next slide, please. And that's a quick summary of how we approach the child tax credit and breaking down that federal policy to Save Our Life members. And Van, I'll hand it off to you for the next speaker.
Yes, I'm going to pull Jamie and Javier into the conversation as well to see how they've been able to take some of the more complex policy issues and message them to the community. Jamie?
Thank you. My name is Dr. Jamie Rogers. I'm the president and CEO of Urban Neighborhood Initiative located in Kansas City, Missouri. And this is a really good question for us. We have had to do a lot of identifying of how we execute to make sure that we are able to both create advocates, create partners, as well as to create an impact. So as we're working through this process, we typically look at it from a lens of a holistic approach to community development. So when we talk to people, first off, we realize that policy issues are people issues. And so we must start with the people. And if it's a people issue, then everything we do centers around that people-centric ideology. And so we start by going to those who are closest to the problems because they're closest to the solutions. And so they deserve their greatest voice. And listening to what they have to say and listen to the issues that we have, we take what we see are the big takeaways and begin to analyze them to be able to present them to the constituents at large, and then largely be able to present policy recommendations to those who can make true and sustainable impact. The question is, how do we take big issues and make them bite-sized? Well, it's no different than the African proverb of how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. And so as you're doing this, the idea is that you are taking what's the big things and you're working around them to be able to begin to move. And as you're beginning to get momentum, you'll begin to pull things along with it to make great strides in impacting policy and those political leaders who are making those policy changes. For us in doing so, what I would suggest is thinking through the idea of having a bucket full of water. And as you have a bucket full of water, you can pile it in with all kinds of things. You can put rocks in it. You can put all kinds of pebbles and boulders. But if you were to take a ping pong ball and put it inside of that bucket and pour water into it, the ping pong bucket is the first thing that rises. So looking at that as an analogy, what's the first thing that we do to make it bite-sized? We take the things that are floating, that are the easiest to grab, the most visible, and those that are able to be seen the most, and we try to create energy around that to be able to pull the rest of the things into orbit so that we can move the entire bucket forward. We even take this a step further. We not only take this to the approach of serving our community constituents, but we take it to our young leaders as well. I believe it's on the screen there. We have different types of camps that we run, different types of symposiums that we will gather. This particular one is an example of one we did called Policy and Advocacy Collective. What we decided to do is to not only put our actions where our mouth was, but to put our money where our mouth was. And so what we decided to do is to get opportunity for young people, young leaders. By young leaders, I mean high school students from the areas that we serve in the heart of Kansas City, known as the urban core. And we begin to build a program that will allow them both to be taught and educated, but also to lend their credibility and their voice. And so we created these cohorts of young, youthful leaders. We brought them in for an 8-week program. These programs were allowing them to be able to come in and to hear from each of our civic leaders. We had presentations and one-on-one question and answers in an intimate setting for people such as our director of housing, our mayor, was able to speak to him. Our superintendent of our school system talked to him. We had local and state and national leaders that we brought in to speak to our young leaders with the hopes of two things. One, that they would get the opportunity to learn from these leaders, and so they could get a better understanding and a sense of how government and policy actually works. But then two, after all of that was done, we allowed them to ask questions to these political leaders and political figures to get questions and answers for some of the concerns that they have. Ultimately, what it did was it took those young people that went through each of those cohorts. They were able to come up with their own policy recommendations based on what they felt were the issues that plagued their lives individually the most. And then we brought all of those same civic leaders back into town again and put them in one room. And we put all of our young leaders in front of them. Each of those young leaders and their groups got to present policy recommendations to those leaders to say, hey, it's a big issue. I may be young, but I have a voice and I have an opinion, and I can tell you what is really bothering me and what's really impacting my life. And so we were able to take what could have been a daunting process of trying to get policy changed and actually begin to see some success in getting policies changed. Why? Because we allowed even those of the youngest of us to have a place on the team to be able to speak their mind and to be able to speak their piece. In designing programming and in designing engagement, what my suggestion is, what's worked for us, is that if you stay close to the people, you'll stay close to the problem. If you stay close to the problem, you'll stay close to the solution. And if you have a platform that gives you a voice to share, you'll be able to take big problems and show them that they're people, not just policies. And if you can show them that they're people, you can make it connect better to a big issue, but with bite-sized accommodations to be successful in getting your policy passed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you all. Javier Martinez, Executive Director of Partnership for Community Action. And I'm actually pinch hitting for my colleague, Associate Director Michelle Gilbert, who I know I'm not going to do her justice, but I'll try my best. PCA for short is, and historically has been an organization that works on immigrant rights. And years ago, we made a decision to not move away from immigrant rights per se, immigration reform and access to driver's licenses and healthcare, but to move more into the tax policy space. And over the years, having done that work with that specific community has really allowed us to frame our messaging in a way that resonates with that particular population. Because that population, we have two different issues, right? We've got the language barrier, first and foremost, but then there's the cultural discussion around tax policy, right? Many of our immigrants that we work with here are either Mexican or Central American, countries with tax systems that are just not really working or in some cases non-existent. So there's sort of a double whammy, if you will, in terms of getting folks to wrap their heads around tax policy. But what it's allowed us to do is to build an army of mostly moms who are now experts in tax policy. And as you know, as I've said over and over again here to groups in New Mexico, for those legislators that deal with tax policy, there's nothing scarier than a bunch of moms of color demanding tax reform. I mean, it really is a game changer at the end of the day. So that's the way we've been able to really message and frame the message around these intricate and sometimes very complex tax policy issues.
Thank you all for that. I know that, like we said, these issues are often very difficult and don't always resonate, but very interesting work there, especially with young people and tax. As Prosperity Now works on tax issues, we know how complex that can be. And we had a question in the chat about sort of soliciting funding to pay for those iPads. Jamie, I'm going to leave that because I know we're going to ask about funding later in this panel conversation, but just keep that in mind that someone was asking about that. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about board members as key stakeholders in advocacy work. So the next question I have for you all is, how do you ensure alignment with your board on policy issues? And I'll start with you, Jamie.
Thank you. So how do we ensure alignment with our board on policy issues? So for us, what we do is, one, we start by picking the right board members. It's paramount that you find people who are not only missionally aligned with the organization, but understands the heartbeat of the service of the organization and the people that they're serving. Most of us, if you're in leadership, you've probably had or somehow do now have a board that's probably made up of both those who are passionate and are the heart driven of what we do and the heartbeats of our missions, but we also have those who are probably more serving because they're leadership positions of corporations, or they're donations for their donors, or they're some kind of way in partnership with you. May I first start by making a parenthetical statement that says this: not all money is good money. Just because people give money, but they don't have the understanding of what you're trying to accomplish and the why behind the what, then they'll miss it, and they can sometimes derail your train or slow you down at best. What I typically do working with my particular board is that we sit down and we have regular conversations, and we have real direct and honest and authentic conversations about real issues. My board's very diverse. My board is made up of some of the most wealthiest people in the communities, as well as our neighborhood leaders themselves. And so when we sit down at a table, sometimes our walks of life are very different, but we are allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and open. But that's a conversation that we have in the beginning. Before anyone's ever considered to be a board member, there's an interview process and a conversation that's had. And it also comes back to how we can align, not only missionally, but align our hearts. Because your money is good, but your connection to the work and becoming a true advocate and a champion for people who may not have the same platform as you is paramount to the success of not only the work we're doing, but to the communities that we're serving. And so we look at it as an alignment of being able to build and to design and to sculpt and create what it is we want to see as the city that we serve. We particularly work in the space of affordable housing as our primary focus. And so we know that in a city where we're 25,000 units short of affordable housing, and most of the people in our communities, more like 78% of them are living in housing poverty, we know that we have to have people who are connected to not only serving in those ways, but connect to the mission of creating affordable housing for people to be able to attain the American dream and be able to have safe places to lay their heads and for their children to be able to rest as well. And so creating avenues of communication and then having avenues of alignment will help you go further simply by just saying, hey, you know what, I appreciate you for your interest in our board position. Here are the requirements of our board members. Here are the expectations and alignments. If you don't align with any of these things, we really appreciate you being interested. We would certainly appreciate your donation, but we may feel that there's a missional misalignment and we need to move on. And it's okay to say no. And so in doing that in the beginning, will save you headache going down the road, because money can't keep you where your character won't sustain you. So that will lead to your struggle as we continue to build down this road of a bridge to policy that actually impacts change in our communities.
I'll pause to see if other panelists have anything to add.
You know, very similar to Jamie. We are a pretty small organization, so our board it tends to be fairly small, and we keep it that way. You know, we have at any given point in time between 5 and 7 board members. Being able to tap into our community for those board members is critical. We hardly bring people from the outside. I think since I've been the executive director, we've only brought in maybe one board member who was not deeply embedded in the work already. But that's really the way we've found to do it, because otherwise it can be a problem. And in our bylaws, our board cannot be larger than 9. And the founder of the organization many years ago had that vision to ensure that the board never became, you know, sort of its own monster, if you will, and then completely reshape the spirit and the perspective of the organization. And as long as I'm the ED, I'll probably stick to that tradition as well, because it's worked for us.
Great, and sticking on the theme of just board members and board alignment, in addition to sort of making sure they're aligned with your policy issues and priorities, how have you been able to get them actually involved in your advocacy efforts, taking action and doing things related to advocacy? Jamie, I'll kick it back over to you to start.
Thank you. So this is a great question, and it's a great parallel segment from the second question we had. What I would say is that we are very intentional, not only with just how we select our board members and how we are engaging with them, but we also are very intentional about the action of what our board members do. The mantra that we use inside of our organization and the philosophy that we live by is that we want to be hands, not fingers. I imagine most of you are looking at your screen like, what the heck does that mean? I'm glad you're looking that way. The reality is fingers are really good at pointing. They can say, look what the problem is. Look what they did. Look what they didn't do. Look how they failed. Look how they weren't successful, or how they tried, or how they went through. And we can point all day long at a million different things. But the reality is hands weren't designed to point. They were designed to lift. They were designed to cultivate, to sculpt, and to build. And so if you're really trying to make a true and lasting impact in communities, we have to stop allowing ourselves, even our team members or our board members, or all of the likings to say, hey, no longer do we live as fingers. Fingers don't do anything but agitate. We need hands that are coming to be alongside of us to work and to build. And so when my board members and myself and our internal leadership team and our organizational culture change to that mindset of, hey, hands, not fingers, we actually say it in our staff meetings all the time, is that it's an opportunity for us to literally have an impact that we're carrying and living and breathing and helping to build and create. And so we have to be able to do that. And that starts off with the board agreement. When we, again, are going back to paralleling question 2, if you're joining our board, if you're considering, I think I'm a little different than our previous panelists, my board members are 29 members on my board, made up of leaders all across our city, some pretty powerful positions. And so I have a fairly robust and fairly large board, but finding those individuals who align with our mission and our purpose, it was a no-brainer and a requirement for us. We didn't have a choice. If they're on our board, they have to be 100% in agreement with what we're trying to accomplish and the policies that we're trying to establish. That board agreement is very clear. It's we call it a love covenant. The love covenant comes in. We usually sit down. The process is somebody's either nominated by one of our board members or recommended by one of our partners. That person will come in, we'll have a conversation, sit down. Usually we'll go get some coffee, or I drink tea or hot chocolate. We sit down and have a conversation, get a chance to hear the heartbeat of what we do. At that point, I usually bring in our board chair, a couple of our team members, maybe a board member or two, and kind of have just a conversation, getting to know each other to make sure that that missional alignment is really intentional and purposeful, because the last thing we want is for our board members to do this. High-fiving is cool when you're having a baseball game, but colliding is not when you're trying to build. What we want is this. We want to have a collaborative, collective work that everybody here is balancing each other and lifting and elevating and serving the community holistically and wholeheartedly. Otherwise, they don't have a seat on our board. And so those are my 2 cents on that. I would just hope that we find the strength and courage to be okay with not having certain people on our boards if they're not going to be missionally aligned.
That's so good. Hands and not fingers. We saw someone in the chat box asking if they can quote that, please. And this is actually a plug for you all to please utilize Twitter. Use the hashtag Camp Prosperity to tweet out any quotes that you're hearing that resonate with you. So please do that. Javier, Radha, if you all have anything to add, if not, I'll move us along to our next question here. And so for question 4, I guess sort of shifting gears a little bit when talking about allies in the community, we know that, having familiar allies is, always makes advocacy impact a little bit stronger. Those familiar allies, you're aware of them, you've partnered with them for years, but creating champions out of some of those unlikely stakeholders can definitely give advocacy campaigns an unexpected boost and provide some visibility to unexpected audiences. So my question for you is, where have you all been able to find unlikely allies or stakeholders in the community? And then how have you been able to engage them? And Radha, I'll kick it over to you to bring you back into the conversation.
Thanks, Vanna. We have found stakeholders in our membership, in the Savor Life membership, especially folks who had not been involved in policy and advocacy efforts before and were new to advocacy. We were working on a state level bill, a tax credit for renters. And we, in the process of advocating for this bill, we reached out to Savor Life members in California to gauge their understanding of this bill. Were you awareness that this bill was going through the legislature and could potentially bring $500 or $1,000 into their pockets to help pay for rent? And as we learned by talking to Savor Life members, folks who were not aware of this bill that was passing through the legislature, but found that they were very interested to learn more about it. They were very interested in the ultimate impact of receiving those tax credits, and they became more open and curious to how they could become involved. We started talking to them about giving testimony or talking to the media about sharing their stories. And another example of a way that we elicited stories from Savor Life members is with the child tax credit. We spoke with Caitlin in Michigan, about the child tax credit, what the funds meant to her. And Caitlin was laid off at the beginning of COVID and had to make some tough trade-offs about work and also childcare and traveling to work while balancing her childcare needs. And many of the calculations that she shared with us were frankly quite dizzying. Very tough decisions to decide how she was going to pay for childcare and also go to work. And we came to learn that she used the child tax credit to pay for childcare to go to work. And she was engaged and motivated to share her story as part of the advocacy effort in favor of the child tax credit. And she had not participated in previous advocacy efforts, so it was a real change.
I can jump in as well. Here in New Mexico, we've had we have a child tax credit, statewide child tax credit for state level. We also have a working families tax credit, which is now over the last couple of years, we've made it one of the most generous in the country. It's up to 25% of the federal earned income tax credit, and it is inclusive of undocumented workers as well as young people that are aging out of the foster care system and who may not have somebody who claims them on their taxes. Two unlikely allies in this work have been some members of the business community, which oftentimes the national narrative is, the chambers of commerce and that sort of crew tend to be on the opposite side of tax policy that benefits, working people instead of just the wealthy. And then the other very unlikely ally in this here in New Mexico has been the Catholic Church. They've taken policy positions here that differ, that are different from sort of the national stuff that we hear about, whether it's repro justice or some of those other very important issues. Here they've taken more of advocacy on behalf of working families, and so those two different entities, I think, have really been helpful to our work in moving and advancing equitable tax reform and equitable tax systems.
I'm going to jump in here and add that one of the things that we found very profound in their advocacy efforts around the child tax credit is really reaching out to the communities and asking them their thoughts, really listening in and taking that effort to listen through interviews, through surveys, really informed our work on the work that on our strategies on how we move forward, but also serve to engage the communities on the policy efforts that we were working on.
Great, and I'm going to move us along to question 5 here. I see we've got a few questions coming into the questions box, and I'll get to them at the end, or excuse me, after my final panel question. But I'm going to move us along to question 5 here, and we're actually also going to skip the pop quiz question for now. We'll get to that after Q&A this afternoon. Hi, Triana. I'm going to pull you into the conversation here in a second. But question 5 for you all is, at what stage do you involve and invite community members to get involved in advocacy? And this question really came about because that was the concept for this entire webinar, I think, is that we oftentimes hear from members of our Prosperity Now community who work for smaller organizations that don't necessarily have the capacity to do a lot of advocacy, let alone to do, to engage community members in their advocacy work, just sort of where to get started. We haven't been able to find the right recipe to get people interested and involved in our advocacy work. So wanted to hear from you all as panelists. When do you invite folks? When do you involve community members in your advocacy work? And Javier, I know you all are doing some great work around community leadership. And so I'll start with you here, and then the others feel free to hop in as well. And Triana, when you do hop in, if you'll introduce yourself and talk about your organization and your role. So Javier, I'll start with you.
Yeah, we try to involve folks almost immediately. For those that are coming in brand new into our work, We usually have a 10-week curriculum. It's a national curriculum called Abriendo Puertas, Opening Doors, which really digs deeper into the whole family dynamic, especially parents with young children and young parents with young children. And so that's sort of the hook, right? And it's technically 10 weeks. By the time we get to like the 4th or 5th week is when we start digging into advocacy and sort of using that as a tool that people can use to take charge of their own lives, right? Because oftentimes we hear in our collective work, you know, pretty traumatizing stories sometimes of things that families go through. It is roughly that 4th or 5th week session when we start digging into advocacy and the power that families have as organized people to change, to advocate for change within the local and in our case, the state system. So it's rather quickly for most people.
I can hop in. I think this is a really great question. I'm Trayana Holiday. I'm the media director with King County Equity Now. We're a policy and advocacy institute that really focuses on, you know, amplifying and kind of what I like to call personifying the solutions that are happening at the community rooted level and really scaling them up so that, you know, everyday community members can engage, can be informed, can participate in collective action that allow for us to create and craft new policy and legislation at the local and state level. So I think that this is a really important question because so much of what I do is around advocacy and hearing from community members at the beginning of what that looks like, you know, making sure that we are crafting pathways that make sense for community members to be a part of these opportunities for advocacy is really important. So there's various stages where we really engage the community on how they can be a part of these advocacy actions that are happening and taking place, but also how they can be a part of the solution, right? Which I think is so key to engaging community members and getting this collective voice as a part of something that's larger, a larger scope. And oftentimes elected officials are looking for opportunities to kind of hear more from, you know, the constituents that they serve. And so I think it's the same when it comes to, you know, community-based organizations. We are there to really serve community, but the best way that we do that is by engaging them early on in the decisions that we have as an organization, early on in the ways that we're going to advocate for them, so that anything that we're doing is really being led and guided by community members and their collective voice. And so we have a wide way that we do this work. And I know that a lot of our community-based partners also do this. When I think about, you know, development, for instance, you know, a lot of our communities are suffering from a lack of community voice in development. So it means that you have to engage them early on at the beginning phase, like, hey, we want to do a new building, right? What kind of building do you need in this community? Let's design it with you and alongside you, not just for you, with us as a smaller team thinking that we know what's best. So there's a lot of different ways that I think we have to engage communities at various stages. And for me in my work, that's what I do, is I create media that is always looking to engage them, to get them to share their voice, to get them to share their ideas about what would be best for them. And that way we can actually advocate for all of those things that we hear at a larger scale. So it really informs the work that I do. And I think it's important to have various opportunities for community to be engaged in their own advocacy, because that's really what this is about.
And I'll jump in and say that I agree with everything that both panelists have just said. When I answered question one, you heard me quote something that says, anything, we're working with communities, those who are closest to the problem are closest to the solution, so they should observe their greatest voice. What I would add to that is that anything done for the people without the people is against the people. And so for those of y'all that are tweeting, hashtag not without me. We don't want to do anything, even policy work on behalf of people without the people, because it's ultimately going to be against them. They didn't have a voice. I happen to grow up in the South in Texas and spent some time in Georgia. My country father told me this. He said, boy, you either at the table or you're on the menu and people will serve you up every time. Well, we make sure that we don't only invite people to the table, but we create tables for people to be at. And in doing so, we want to make sure that from day one, step one, conversation one, that our policy work and our community development work are aligning with the people say they're needing. And so as we're building out our programmatic activity, our engagement, as our policy coordinators and community navigators are serving to build policy recommendations and cases to be presented to our local, state, national leaders, we know that we don't have a voice, we don't have a strength, we're only helping to personify the voices of the community. And so we happen to have a platform that works, that allows us to be able to put them in spaces and in rooms where they may not have been able to get in previously. But we know that that only starts by including them from when we first walk through the door, from the first conversation. And so if you take the approach like we do, our mentality is if it's done for them without them, then it's against them. And we aren't against the people, we're with the people. And so we stand and we fight with them.
And Jamie, before I move on to the next question, I just want to say, if you are offering up motivational classes, Dr. Rogers, please sign me up. Your analogies and your quotes have just been top notch. I've really enjoyed listening to you speak, as well as all of the panelists. But I'm like, this is a motivational speaker, Dr. Rogers. So next, and just the, you know, and as far as involving community members in advocacy work, you know, there's the awareness piece where there's the messaging and you know, pulling apart the issues and making them bite-sized. But then there's the actual like mobilizing and engaging people, the real work of getting people to move and take action, which can be particularly challenging in an election year, right? We are all bombarded with political ads and, you know, vote for me, and people are getting text messages. And so it's hard to sort of compete with that. I feel like you're competing with these political ads and just getting people to try to advocate for EITC expansion or to try to advocate for baby bonds or whatever are happening in the states. So I wanted to hear from you all and see how do you mobilize and engage communities in election year activities, or just in an election year? There's this, you know, I think, you know, there's two sides of things. You want to advocate for policy and for legislation and that piece, but then there's also a piece of wanting to encourage people to get out to vote and do some GOTV activities. So just talking about election year advocacy activities and how you're able to do that. Javier, I think I'll kick it over to you to start this one.
Sure. Well, you know, you're right. Elections are getting more and more savvy, and their outreach is getting a lot more efficient, it seems like. I think while I've been on this call, I've gotten at least 3 or 4 text messages for different people running for different things somewhere, and I've never met them. I don't even know where they're from sometimes. You know, I think for us, it's always paramount to recognize and to relate to our community members that while elections matter, and they absolutely do, our advocacy work is 24/7, 7 days a week, election or no election. And we should not be mobilized only when there's an election. That's something that I've, you know, wearing my other hat, I've really tried to relate to our state officials and candidates not to engage us only when there's an election coming up. Engage us all the time. And thank you for going back to the slide, because I think it really illustrates how we do our work. You know, the most radical thing we do as an organization is build relationships, is sit across the table from our neighbors, have a discussion about the economy, have a discussion about inflation, have a discussion about the lack of access to fair lending, home ownership, etc. It is through that process that we are able to reconnect families with their inherent leadership. And once you reconnect or help people reconnect with that inherent leadership, the sky is the limit. You know, we have example after example, in our case, of undocumented immigrant single moms who understand the value and the importance of their voice. We've got pictures plastered all over our wall of many times when these moms have gone on to the state capitol or even to Congress in some cases and gotten in the face of legislators who don't understand their plight. It is in that process that you start to see those systemic changes, right? Is when you have these organized communities. Once people have realized their power, that the system begins to shift. You know, I joke all the time that 10 years ago, if we would have had this call 10 years ago, all you would have heard from me was the fight to keep driver's licenses in the hands of undocumented people. That was all we could accomplish. That was the gold standard. Fast forward 10 years later, we have a child tax credit at the state level. We've got one of the most generous working families tax credits in the country that is inclusive. We have a ballot initiative here in the November election to redistribute approximately $250 million per year in perpetuity to build an early childhood development infrastructure that will include everything from universal childcare and pre-K, potentially all the way to cash payments to parents of young children. It's got to be one of the most robust redistribution of wealth programs we have seen probably in the country. That is all made possible by the advocacy of leaders in organized communities who have pushed the ball forward without blinking over the last 10 years. From driver's licenses in our hand, all the way to a redistribution of wealth unlike we've ever seen before. And that's happening through the efforts of these families, and it's happening through the efforts of these unlikely coalitions that have come together to advocate in support of these policy shifts.
That's very inspiring to hear, and congratulations. I'd like to add that one of the approaches we took at Savor Life was to really invest in relationships, to work alongside people from the very, very beginning, to ask them what they wanted and how they wanted to see some of the information that we had to share with them, how they wanted to be involved with policy and advocacy, and investing in that relationship up front ended up being a real solid foundation for mobilizing later on. And with the federal child tax credit, we followed up 1 year later and said, well, this policy didn't go forward. It wasn't made permanent. And to follow up and say, but we did all of these things to fight for the child tax credit, helped to close some of that loop and helped to reinforce that relationship that we're working alongside our families. It helped to invest in a relationship based on trust.
I think that's so key too. And I also find that a lot of this is when we are educating our community members on the importance of, you know, who is representing them, the importance of the vote, the importance of policy and legislation that is on the ballot. There's something so key about the education piece, as you guys were both saying there, to build relationship, right? And to be a trusted organization in your community, you have to meet people where they are. It is a key point and metric that we utilize to say, look, we're going to give you this information that in a way that you can understand it. You know, right? We were holding a bunch of teach-ins, you know, where people were we were coming out to the streets and people just sitting in the streets, listening to amazing speakers tell them about some of the things that were going to be impactful in their lives. I think, you know, one of our goals is how are we elevating the material conditions of Black families? And we go to that idea and that thought every time we're looking to educate anyone from our community to really highlight the things that are important for them to be paying attention to, particularly in these election years, right? We know that, you know, advocacy, it wanes, it exceeds and it wanes. There's moments of time where a lot of people want to be engaged, and there are other times where people are busy and they're like, oh, I don't have time for that right now. And so meeting people where they are, I think, is a key metric, as you guys were talking about, to building those relationships and becoming one of those trusted organizations. They know, you know what, these guys have been consistent in their way of approaching us in community. They've been consistent in the education that I've been able to get. I've learned so much, things I didn't know existed, right? So we have to actually utilize the tools before us to do that work. And it does take a wide variety of ranges, right? Because you want to be on social, but you also want to talk to the elders. You know, every third Friday of the month, I get to convene this critical conversations group of elders who are like, look, tell us what's going on. How do we get engaged? How do we get plugged in, right? And this is really from a legacy of Dr. Maxine Mims, who's been doing this for, almost 20 years. And the idea that we get to inject ourselves in these spaces, become real trusted members in these spaces because of our relationships is just key to how we get things done, and really educating our community members on the importance of them utilizing their vote, whether it's an election year or beyond. I like what you said there, Javier, that it's all the time, it's 24/7. We are there no matter what's going on in the rest of the world. We have to be that trusted source, and I think that's one of the ways we have to do that.
I'll throw in a practical approach to everything that was just stated, because that's great work that's going on. For us, we try to eliminate those barriers along with all that was just stated here. With us, when we say we're trying to eliminate the barriers, we just saw one of the most egregious acts against people in voting rights since we got the right to vote take place right after the last presidential election. But we knew that was taking place because we were doing work, and we knew some of the policymakers were going to be trying to do what they did, actually. And so we did some things that were very practical. We got butts and seats. We went, rented vans, and we went door to door. We picked people up, took them to the polls, and brought them back out and brought them home. If they were waiting in long lines because there were closing polling locations, we made sure we had breakfast burritos, we had granola bars, we had snacks, peanuts, we had water, we had Gatorade, we had energy drinks, whatever they needed to stay in that line to get their votes out, let their voices be heard. That's what we did. And so we started at about 5 o'clock in the morning, and we went till about 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. And we made sure that every person at different locations, they wanted to go vote. They had no excuse not to. We made sure they had their ID beforehand. We made sure their registration was taken care of beforehand. And then we were able to connect them to rides to get them to and from. We partnered with our local churches and some of our civic organizations who had transportation and buses, and said, hey, every person takes a block, here's a grid, and your job is just to run this route back and forth, picking people up, taking them back, making sure they get a chance to cast their vote and their voices can be heard. And so we just had to eliminate the barrier. The barrier was we had transportation struggles, and the barrier was we had polling places closing. Barriers were that they were looking for any and every reason to not allow us to vote. And so we said no more. No longer could we stand to the side and watch such acts take place, and with people who have already gone through so much in disinvestment. And so we invested in the practical to help them to be able to find their voice and be able to share it.
Thank you all for that. I would have remained quiet because I could have listened to this particular part of the conversation forever. I'm an organizer in my background, so I just love hearing about just engaging people in the community. But I have a final question, and a very important one that goes back to a question that we got earlier in the questions box. You all are doing some excellent work in the community as far as engaging stakeholders, building out these ambassadors. But we know, if we're being real, this work is not possible without funding, without money. And so I thought it would be fitting just to sort of end this conversation with talking about just that, how you all have been able to attract funding for your advocacy and community building work. And Triana, I think I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vanna. This is important. I mean, it goes back to relationship building. One of the things that we always start with any possible funder is, what's important to them in terms of their funding pedagogy. How do they come across these different organizations to say, well, we like what you're doing, or hey, we have this opportunity here, we have this grant. Now, one of the things that many of us on this panel probably understand is this nonprofit industrial complex, right? There's only so much money. We all have great missions and visions, right? We all do great work, and yet there isn't enough money to make sure that all of our work is sustained over time. So there's this constant competitiveness that we have to have. And I love to break that down from the very gate. We come with a centralized message to any of our donors or our funders. We say, look, if you're really serious about philanthropy, we need you to understand the reasons why what we do is so necessary in our community and why you want to fund that work. But if you're not interested in building a real long-standing relationship with us, we don't want transactional funds here, right? And so we've had to really set the tone and try to change up the way that I think traditional philanthropy has worked in the past with regard to, well, you know, we're going to give you this money as long as you do X, Y, Z. You know, you got to check off these boxes. It's very rigid and it puts you in a box. And so we've said, look, we're not really interested in that kind of funding, because honestly, that kind of funding has led us to where we are today. It's not funding the sustainability of an institution and an organization to be impactful in their community in a way that has and results in long-lasting generational change. So we step up with that language. And oftentimes funders are like, whoa, you know, you guys are trying to tell us how to do our jobs. And we say, no, we know, because we are on the ground. Not only are we a community-based organization that's serving the community, but our staff is built from the community. We are the community members we're looking to serve. And so it changes the game, I think, too, and really allows funders to understand in order to partner with us, they got to be interested in that long-lasting relationship. They got to move away from their ideas about the best way to fund this work and start to really work in partnership with organizations to get funding done and to get it done in the right ways that's going to have the most long-lasting impact. So for us, you know, it's always about relational versus transactional. And I think one of the things that I really love about this model and this approach is we have a lot of funders who come back to us and say, you know, if it wasn't for you guys saying this, if it wasn't for you bringing this to light for us, we're just stuck in automatic mode sometimes and just trying to get the funding out the door, not realizing that the ways that we've been doing it are also causing harm in the long run. And so, you know, I think there's a bit more of education that happens on the front end with the way that we go after this kind of funding. But we also understand too that it takes a lot for us at any organization that's looking to really educate and bring up to speed these philanthropic partners who say, you know what, we've been doing this work, we know what's best, and we go, no, you know, we challenge them. And that right there, I think is one of the ways that we've been able to really create some sustainable relationships where, you know, people are really willing to see the longevity of our work. And it takes time to get an organization up to speed and, you know, is staffed properly so that we can do the work in the greatest ways. But we have, you know, partners that fund us for multiple years because of that, right? And so it really sometimes is on us to educate these funders and to give them the opportunities to have their funding have a greater impact.
So this is a question that I've been waiting on because it gets me excited. So bear with me if I get in it for a second. Lil Wayne said it best. He said, I went shopping the other day and I realized talk is still cheap. For us, we have to realize that the connection to money is also the connection to power and influence in a lot of respects. We know that when we're working with our partners, we're building out opportunities for them to make true and sustainable impact, not just an impression, much different. Impression looks good on social media. Impact actually does good in communities. There's a wise street philosopher that I love to quote. His name is Rod Tidwell, known from the movie Jerry Maguire, and he simply said it best. He said, show me the money. When we talk to our donors, we're talking to our partners, when we're engaging with our constituents, we're letting them know, hey, we need your time, we need your talents, and we need your treasure. If you can't give us those three things, then you're not aligning with us. We need to figure out how we can connect to those three things to build the capacity. Like my sister just said, building capacity of organizations. I would challenge each of you all in your respective organizations to challenge the status quo of how it is that we do this thing called philanthropy. No more do we have to tap dance to get dollars from somebody. No more do we have to show that we're better than just to be able to get less than. The reality is they need to be able to see the work that we're doing and realize that they'll never have connections the way we have connections in authentic ways. And they should be behind us and supporting us and encouraging us, eliminating barriers to financing and capital so that we can build that that team of servants that can go out and help these communities and serve the people that we've been called to do so. And so challenging that status quo on being able to get unrestricted multi-year, that's the only conversation I have with donors. I don't ask for a $5,000 or $10,000 check anymore. It's, we need you to make a real impact. If you're truly invested in the work we're doing, make a true investment, make a multi-year commitment, and make that impact last and make it unrestricted so we can best use it how we need to, not try to tap dance for a program. On top of that, I would add in a couple of things too. When we're building in this connection, it is very much so relational. It is very much so connecting, but we've learned how to have conversations with our board members who have different backgrounds and our partners who have different backgrounds, and we've been able to weaponize privilege. Weaponizing privilege is a key thing to being able to say, hey, one, own the fact that you have a privilege that most people in our communities don't have. Two, identify the fact that you will have spaces and you have a voice and you have a platform and you have financial resources that most of the people in our city don't have. Three, we need you to do something with it. No longer is it time for you to sit around and look good. No longer is it time for you to go paint a house for a couple hours on a Saturday and said you did something. We need you to actually show up and show up in a real, in a tangible, and an authentic way, or don't show up at all. Because what's the point if you're not going to really make a true and lasting impact in doing so? And I'll leave it with this. One of the best quotes I ever heard came from a wise young brother by the name of Neo. He said, I'm a movement by myself, but I'm a force when we're together. I'm good all by myself, but baby, you make me better. When we talk to our donors, we say, look, we're doing good work, but we want you to make us better. Can you help us grow? Can you make an honest impact? Will you honestly connect with the work? Will you do something more than just talk about it? Will you be about it? And if you are, then we down with you. Let's do something. Let's go serve. Let's go work. If you're not, though, you're not going to hinder us. Step out of the way. Either move over or get rolled over. Or as the words of Beans, either get down or lay down. But either way, something's getting ready to go down. And so we are building out capacity to help our organization continue to grow, make impact, ultimately helping communities be able to build impact and to grow and to have a voice so they can advocate and bring some real tangible change to their communities.
I love it. I love it. As much as I hate to end, we must start to take questions from our audience. Thank you so much to the four of you. This has been such a rich conversation. I know that folks have gotten a lot out of it by the questions and comments box, but I wanted to open it up for some questions from our audience this afternoon. The first one is, we're trying to re-energize our coalition steering committee and get everyone on the same page. So I've considered writing a job description. Do you think this would actually cause opposition due to the fact that they are volunteers? Second part of that question is, how do I get their buy-in? So steering committee members, if anyone wants to hop in and take that question.
Yeah, I mean, this is something where, you know, transparency is key here. I think it's less of like a job description and more understanding what the expectations are if you're a part of the steering committee. Because when we think of job, it's just unfortunate that we immediately think something that's paid, right? And so maybe you just tweak it by having an expectations amendment. Like, this is what you're expected to do as a steering committee member. And here is, you know, the reasons why you want to get engaged. Oftentimes, again, as we've been talking about here on the panel, even though I joined late, I know there's been talk, and I said it too, about meeting people where they are. And so if you already have a group of interested individuals from the community, you know, we have something similar where we call it our community steward panel, and we just tap in with them. We say, hey, we want you to take a look at this. Tell us what you think. We try to make it very easily accessible for them, and do it in ways where sometimes I got to go meet an elder at their home to, again, have that conversation with them. So it does mean that oftentimes it's on us to find the ways to connect with folks and get them re-engaged, particularly if there's been a hiatus there. You know, how you get folks re-engaged is really key. But I think meeting people where they are and maybe tweaking it from job description to, you know, hey, here are the expectations. We want you guys to understand what it means to be on this and what it means to serve in this way, and how we're looking to benefit and the benefits that you'll also gain from it.
Thank you, Triana. Another question here in the questions box. How do we push for more influence in legislative spaces, in legislative places and spaces? As advocates, we are competing with the capitalist system. So do we organize to create solutions through this route, or do we push for action plans to implement the change through community organizational relationship planning perspective? So I think the question there is influence and legislative spaces. Javier, I think you have unmuted for this one.
Yeah, look, I think it's both. You know, we have to be in the room. It is a capitalist system, and it will continue to be. I don't see how it won't be, at least not in my lifetime. And so we have to make sure that we are in the room where decisions are being made, and we have to be in the room with the stories to share. We've got to be in the room ready and willing to hold people accountable, and you know, protest when we need to. And we also need to be prepared to walk into that room and cut a deal and make a compromise. That's the way the legislative process works. And quite frankly, that's the way true organizing works. Organizing is about pragmatism, and it's about understanding when to cut the deal, understanding as well that tomorrow we're going to go fight for that other little piece that we didn't get yesterday, right? Now, as community-based organizations, I think we, here in New Mexico, we operate in an ecosystem, and it kind of goes to the previous question, right? We were trying to avoid all of the funding issues and sort of this Hunger Games that foundations play sometimes. And a few years ago, many of the organizations in New Mexico that do this type of work came around the table and said, enough is enough. I'm not going to compete with my sister organization for $25,000 to do what, right? And so we really challenged funders to come through in a different way with transformational investments, multi-year investments, non-restricted investments. And I think that allows the ecosystem to grow in a way where some of our organizations are going to hold you accountable as a politician, and they're gonna, they're not gonna let you dine in peace, right? If you do us wrong. At the same time, within that same ecosystem, we have other organizations that perhaps are more willing or able to sit at the table, to be in the room, all together, still moving forward in the same direction. So there's a lot of trust, there's a lot of relationship, and there's a recognition that the system is such. And in organizing, we always talk about the world as it is and the world as it should be. We have to operate in the world as it is. Otherwise, all we're doing is tweeting from our armchair here and telling the government how terrible they are, and not impacting change for the people who need to have that change made, because their livelihood depends on it.
I might add into, back to when I said weaponizing privilege. Sometimes for me, the meeting is not asking for money. Sometimes the meeting is asking for their voice or their influence. Time, talent, or treasure. Sometimes you get all three, sometimes you only get one or two. But when we do that, we say, hey, listen, I'm not here to ask you for any money. I'm not here to ask you to show up and do anything yet. I'm asking you, will you send an email on my behalf? Will you send an email on behalf of our organization to be able to find time to meet with this political leader, get time to speak on this issue, or to find a way for them to influence, so that you can get spaces to be able to speak your voice. Sometimes it's not about what you do and what you know, it's in who you know. And sometimes it's just simply, hey, you can call this person on their personal cell phone because y'all live next door to him. Y'all play golf every Saturday. Can you call him and say, hey, will you be willing to give a colleague of mine 5 minutes of your time, and allow them to use their privilege of connection and being in proximity to your benefit for your purpose.
I will add that sharing stories, real people, and how policies have impacted them, what the tax credit means to them, it really breaks down the policy wonky terms of tax credits into human, real terms, and sharing those stories, lifting up those stories, gives agency and voice to those ultimately impacted by those policies, and helps us as advocates serve as a bridge to decision makers. So as simple as it may seem, to lift up stories. It's ultimately, I believe, one of the most powerful tools we have in our toolkit.
And I'll remind folks that in just a second, I'll do our pop quiz question. I know people tend to get very excited about that, so hang tight for that. But a couple more questions here, and also a final call for questions. If you all have any burning questions for our panelists, please put them in the chat box so that I can ask them before we sign off here. But another question says, panelists have talked about building relationships for success in this area. Relationships are complex. What best practices for building relationships in advocacy, coalition building, and alliances can you share?
That's a great question. I think you know, this is nothing new to any of us. The ways that we have always built relationships, there's something personal about your approach that you take to building a relationship, right? And I take a lot of the things that I've done in my own life and I bring them to bear. I think part of it for me is transparency. And we talk about, there's something that is very genuine about transparent nature of how you first start a relationship, because it begins to establish trust, right? And so I think the two go hand in hand. And if you're, thinking about it from an organizational perspective, you got to make sure that people understand what it is you're there to do as an organization to begin to build those relationships and establish a foundation of shared values, right? A shared set of principles that you're going to move under in terms of what that relationship can muster, what can come out of that relationship, what you're looking to gain from the relationship. Many community members that I deal with, some of them still have a lot of other traumas. So meeting people again where they are is so key to that. But if I don't do it in a very genuine way, if I can't be consistent in, showing up and doing what I say I'm going to do, being a solid woman of my word, all of those same values and principles I have to take with me at the organizational level, so that when we say we're going to do something, we show up, so that we show up consistently for community, so that we show them the transparency. All right, look, this is what's going on. When you guys read that news article, hey, here's some of the background stories so you guys know what's going on. We have to find ways to do that while still protecting, of course, the organization, but allowing community members to understand that we too are a set of people from community who are doing this work on behalf of community and alongside community. And in order for us to do that well, we need to have those relationships. So I'll also say too that a lot of us, for my organization in particular, especially our leadership, we all already have so many relationships, trusted relationships and community that we brought into the organization with us. And that alone, like me having my name attached to an organization, people say, okay, well, I already know her in community, because as you were saying earlier, Vanna, being a community organizer, being from community, you already grew up with a lot of folks that, you've built relationships over time, and they've been able to see, you show up as your authentic self over time. And so bringing a lot of that kind of relationship capital into my organization, I said, look, I can't partner and work for any organization that doesn't have shared values with me, right? If you're looking to do things kind of in a shady way, or you want to do things with a veil over the community's eyes, I can't work there, right? So I think a lot of what I brought here into this organization and others on my staff that brought in, these amazing attributes and relationships from community really helped to establish a foundation of how we're going to do things as an organization. So I say it really starts with your personal relationships, and some of the ways that you have always built relationships, you got to bring in, to an organization that you're working with or working for.
I'll pause here to see if anyone else has anything to add before I get into our pop quiz question.
I would just make it personal. For us, we call it our MVP. It's the MVP plan we do all day, every day. What's our mission, what's our vision, and what's our purpose? When we talk to our communities, one, just being consistent, showing up. Like, we don't have to have answers. We don't have to be polished every time. We just show up. Sometimes it's on somebody's front porch just having a conversation. But then also everything we do, we move purposefully. We don't just haphazardly or passively do things. When we show up, we know exactly what our mission is, what our vision is, and what our purpose is for both the community we're serving as well as the organization in which we work for. And so when you're making connections, finding authentic connections of people that you can say, hey, here's our MVP. Does it match with your MVP? Cool. If it does, then we're able to really build this connection. If not, let's have conversations to see how we can better find synergy and alignment. So I think if you can keep the MVP in the front of your mind, it negates all of the bickering amongst people. It takes away the pettiness. It takes away from people who don't want to work with you, or organizations who don't like you for whatever reason, or don't work with you, don't partner with you, funders not wanting to fund you. It really puts it in the forefront of everything. Everything comes down to, despite what you like or dislike, are you down with our mission? Are you down with our vision? And are you down with our purpose? If you are, then we down with you. If not, then it's cool. We can eventually get there, hopefully. And I think that would help build connection and build authentic relationships and partnerships and communities.
Absolutely. Thank you all so much for that, for answering our questions. In a second, I'll put our speakers' email addresses on the screen, their contact information. If you all have additional questions after the webinar, please feel free to reach out to them. And I see, Carmela, your comment here, transparency is key. Either we can or we cannot. Love the comment on transparency and relationships are key, not just transactional. So thank you for that, Carmela. Want to move us along to do a quick pop quiz question for you all. Earlier in the webinar, Radha presented on some of the ways that Savor Life was able to build their content series. And as you all know, as a reminder, the first person to type the correct answer into the questions box will win a small prize from Prosperity Now. So the question is, name one of the ways Savor Life was able to build their content series. It was on the screen earlier, one of the bullet points. If someone can name for me one of the ways, just one, that Savor Life was able to build their content series. Malacio Garcia, you are very fast there. Interactive quiz was one of those ways. So Malacio Garcia, you are this afternoon's pop quiz winner. And the 4 ways were expert articles, social media, newsletter, or interactive quiz. So thank you all for taking the time to do our pop quiz this afternoon. Also want to shout out our social media winner, the person who has tweeted the most this afternoon, Donna Thompson Bennett. We will also send you a small prize from Prosperity Now, Donna Thompson Bennett. Twitter handle Love Peace DTB. You are our social media winner this afternoon. And I apologize, we didn't have Javier's picture and his contact information there on the screen, but please keep in touch, because we know you had to pinch hit, and we thank you so much for joining the webinar with such short notice. But please stay in touch with our speakers if you have additional questions or anything. They've been great this afternoon, really rich conversation. I hope that you all enjoyed it as much as I did. So I'll take a second to let you all screenshot this slide if you'd like, just to have our speakers' contact information there on the screen. And I'll move us along here to talk about some quick next steps before we wrap up this afternoon. Please, I would encourage you all, or nudge you all, to please complete our follow-up survey. Again, it's another way to win prizes for those of you all who are like me and just love to win stuff. Please complete our survey. We always draw a name and award a small prize to someone for completing the survey. Mark your calendars for our next and final webinar of this Camp Prosperity series. It's called Equity to Justice, Reimagining Strategies for Community-Driven Solutions. It's next Tuesday, a week from today. We've got a great lineup of panelists for that conversation as well, and it'll just round out our 2022 Camp Prosperity season. And then finally, please register for the 2022 Prosperity Summit that's taking place in Atlanta. We are really excited. If you enjoyed Trayana today, she will also be speaking at the Prosperity Summit in Atlanta in a couple weeks. So you will hear from her again, as well as a whole host. And Radha is also speaking in Camp Prosperity in a couple weeks as well. So if you've enjoyed them here, they will be joining us in Atlanta, along with a whole host of speakers. We've got a great lineup. Our complete speaker list should be being released here pretty soon in the next couple days or weeks at Prosperity Now. But it'll be a great time. You'll meet me in person, meet a lot of our other advocates, meet your peers in person. It'll just be a great opportunity to come together in person again and talk about the issues that we are also very passionate about. So the link for the Prosperity Summit is in the chat. We are currently running an early bird special. So I think we are still within the window of the early bird special where you'll get our lowest price possible for the Prosperity Summit. So wanted to take a minute to plug that for you all as well. On the next slide, we talk advocacy. This is an advocacy series, and I always want to bring you all's attention to a very easy way to take action and advocate. If you're not already a part of our Prosperity Now Advocacy Center, please take a moment to sign up. The link there is in the chat for you. It's absolutely free. It's a place that where you can go to look up your legislator, your local, your state, your federal legislators. Look them up, email them, call them, tweet at them. You can schedule a meeting through their scheduler in our Action Center or our Advocacy Center. You can sign petitions that will go to them. All of those things, all of those easy, quick, one-stop shop things that you can do as it relates to advocacy, you can find it in our Advocacy Center. So please sign up if you are not already a member of our Advocacy Center. And then lastly, I just encourage you all to join our Prosperity Now networks. Connect with your peers on our 4 big issue areas: affordable housing, campaign for every kid's future, financial security, and then our taxpayer opportunity network. That link is in the chat as well for you to join your peers to just talk programs and policy in those 4 respective areas. With that, thank you again so much to our speakers. I know we have 5 minutes left, so with these 5 minutes, I'm actually going to turn it back over to you speakers to see if you all have any final thoughts before we close out this afternoon on just engaging ambassadors, getting people involved in this work. So I'll give you each about 30 seconds to give any final thoughts that you all have.
I'll start us off.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thanks, Javier. I just want to say, invest early in relationships, invest in listening, invest in building trust, and elevate voices.
Go fight, win.
Okay, there we are. Sorry, I had to unmute. I'll say that, you know, we've uplifted a lot of different solutions here, but it is important to be engaged. That is the big lesson here. You know, all of us can do all of this work, but if we do not have communities that are engaged, it's almost a moot point, because honestly, organizations cannot do this work alone. It's on every individual to find an opportunity to be engaged. As Vanna was sharing there, that advocacy center is so important. Look at ways to take action. Oftentimes, organizations are going to try to compile a lot of information for you, but if you do not take the action and don't press your elected officials to do what's best for your communities, we'll continue to see the status quo thrive. So I just really encourage everybody to do what you can to stay engaged and see yourself as a part of the solution.
All right. Thank you all again for the opportunity. I'll just close with this and say, vision will never take you where provision can't sustain you and purpose won't fulfill you. When you're doing this, stay the race. It's a marathon that will align you with your purpose. You will be able to be successful if you stick with it. Remember one thing, you're already the blessing. You just have one job, continue to be the blessing. Appreciate you guys.
Awesome. Thanks so much to our wonderful panelists. And like I said, I hope that you all as the audience enjoyed it, and we will see you next week for our final session of Camp Prosperity. Thanks everyone, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Vanna.
Thanks, Vanna.